Good morning. My name is Suzette Martinez Standring, and welcome to It's All Right with Suzette, a half-hour show about authors, their works, and the craft of writing. And today, our focus is going to be on Marian poetry. What's that, you ask? Well, it's poetry based on the life of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And we have an award-winning poet and author with us today, Carl Winderl, who is going to be sharing with us his inspiring new book of poetry called The Gospel According to Mary. It is the fourth book that follows Mr. Winderl's other poetry books, Mary Speaks of Her Son, Via de La Croce, and Behold the Lamb. Carl Winderl has published other works, including nonfiction, award-winning works, and we're so happy and honored to have him here today. Now, for you poetry lovers, it will be fascinating for you to know that his poetry has been favorably compared to that of Thomas Merton, John Donne, and Pier Paolo Pasolini. Currently, Mr. Winderl works as an overseas educator, and his last post in the United States was with Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego as a writing professor. Take a moment and you will see the cover of his book, The Gospel According to Mary. It is a most beautiful painting by Italian Renaissance painter Antonello de Messina, who painted it in 1476, and it's called The Virgin Annunziata, and it is really a beautiful cover. So welcome, Carl Winderl. It's wonderful to have you beaming in from Europe.
Well, thank you, Suzette. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you for making this happen. What we're about to do, what we're about to talk about, really makes my heart happy. So I really appreciate you making this happen for me and for all of us, actually.
Your book of Marian poetry is very inspiring. And I would like to ask you first, if you could share why you chose the Mother of Jesus to write about in your now fourth book of Marian poetry.
Well, it's not that long of a story, actually. The first Marian poem that I remember writing, I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago back in 1974. And the poem that I wrote is called An Immaculate Conception, and maybe I'll get a chance to read it in a little while here. And that kind of set the ball rolling for me to be intrigued by not just the subject matter, but the idea of having Mary, the mother of Jesus, be the narrator. That it's her voice as she tells the story. And over the years, I began to write more and more poems, and fortunately, Finishing Line Press started publishing my poems. And the book that we're talking about now and the painting that we're talking about now kind of came to me too. My last book was in 2015, Behold the Lamb. And when I finished that, I was thinking, well, what comes next? And so I thought, why not string together in a chronology poems that tell the story of the life of Jesus. Mary's the speaker, but the subject is actually her son. And so as I was beginning to shuffle poems, putting them into a chronology, I thought, what would be a good cover? And the cover that you referred to, the Antonello de Messina painting, Virgin Annunziata, I was leafing through religious art books, visiting websites and galleries. And when I came to that one, it just kind of spoke to me and said, this is the painting. This is the cover for the next book. And at that point, I had thought about the title, The Gospel According to Mary, and the title seemed to fit what I envisioned as her perspective and how she was going to be different from the other Gospels. So the other Gospels we know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all tell the story of Mary from starting with Jesus' birth. John's a little bit different there, and they start with the Annunciation, and this painting is about the Annunciation. But for me, I think it really works well because her approach is so different. In this painting, it's very, very different. A lot of the Annunciation paintings show Mary with Gabriel, and there are other angels floating around, and she's in a garden, and she has this ethereal look on her face. But the Antonella painting shows her looking straight forward. And if you look carefully at the title, at the book cover, she's standing at a little lectern, and there are pages with writing on them. And it's as if she is speaking or has stopped and wants you to think about something that she said. And so for me, that's just typical of this atypical approach. And Mary's going to tell the story about her son from her point of view, different from the other gospel stories.
Yes, Carl, I agree. And I did a little research on that painting, and it talks about how Mary is actually interrupted in the middle of her prayer when the appearance of the archangel comes with the news that she is going to carry the baby Jesus. Now, what I think is so interesting is that you don't have to be Catholic or even particularly religious to appreciate that universal symbolism of mother's love, of a mother's love, the great compassion and sacrifice that Mary went through in the great and at the same time terrible responsibility of seeing her own child grow up to do wonderful things to fulfill a prophecy, but at the same time suffering. And I like what you said about how you chose the title, The Gospel According to Mary, because it is about her son's life, but from her perspective. And tell us a little bit about, some of the insights into her perspective as in this book as the narrator.
Yes, the other gospel writers all start with his birth. And for her, as you just said, she goes through unimaginable suffering. She is told from the time that Jesus is presented in the temple by Simeon that he's going to be a great son, but he's going to cause great sorrow for lots of people, and that she will feel a sword pierce her heart. So you're right, for her whole life, she knows that her son will be great, but there are going to be moments when it's going to hurt her terribly. And so what I envisioned for her and what I've carried through here, what makes her perspective unique, is that she doesn't start with her son's birth. The very first poem is his crucifixion. It's still the chronology, but she chooses the worst moment of his life because she wants to get it out of the way. So she deals with the crucifixion. She goes chronologically through the burial, through his resurrection, through his ascension. He goes up into heaven, back to heaven after leaving earth. And it's at that point, then she juxtaposes his being reborn or born again within her mind. She juxtaposes that to the first time when he was born on earth and he becomes a little baby. And then that's where she picks up the story. And then the chronology continues until actually the last poem, spoiler alert here, the last poem of the 62 is when Judas kisses him on the cheek. And it's at that point that for her, it's the high point of her son's life, because what it symbolizes that he accepts God's will in his life. In Matthew 26, verse 38, he says in the garden, "Not my will, but thine be done."
Carl,
that is, yes.
Go ahead.
Oh no, that makes her happy because that echoes what she said in Luke 1:38. She said, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord, let it be unto me according to thy will."
And Carl, I think that it's so important, especially for poetry, to be heard out loud. So I would like to give our viewers a chance to hear one of your poems right now, if you don't mind.
Okay, I think what I'll do, I'm getting a nudge here. I think I'm going to do the Kneeling at the Manger.
All right, Kneeling at the Manger, okay.
Kneeling at the Manger. This is the poem. One of the things that I like about Mary is that she gives us the inside. She gives us the backstory. The other gospel writers, when they talk about the manger scene, it's like, oh, look at Mary, meek and mild, with her little baby child. They do this like away at the manger, Currier and Ives thing.
Right, right.
They say she ponders these things in her heart, but they don't say, what is it that she's pondering?
Well, I'm excited to hear it.
Okay, so this poem, Kneeling at the Manger, is Mary meeting shepherds.
All right.
But these are not the shepherds that most people think of. These are the shepherds who raise the lambs for Passover, and they
I'm
give
excited to hear it, Carl. Let's do it.
give the lambs to people. So this is Kneeling at the Manger. It's the title. You're going to hear my voice, but it's actually Mary who is the speaker here. Kneeling at the manger. Staffs at their sides, hushed mouths agape, reeking not of frankincense and myrrh, but of linseed oil, sulfur, pitch, and tar. These rough men stared, stunned by my son's birth, shocked and amazed, gazing at him. Their faces, though I recognize, they're the providers of the Paschal lambs at Passover. For the temple, they breed and they take from the ewes their firstborns to bleed and suffer, sacrificed to atone for Israel's sin. But when their shepherd eyes meet mine, I see on their adoring faces a glimpse of mute surprise. Some wonder, and in eyebrows rise disbelief, while something in their furtive sidelong glances causes me to further ponder more, for they have been trained to know a sacrificial lamb when they see one. So the poem ends with that last line separate from the rest of the poem. And the one, the zero, is the capital zero. So what?
Carl, we have to pause for a break. Okay. And when we return, we'll get to hear more insights from Carl Winderl into his book of poetry, The Gospel According to Mary. A beautiful poem, and there's more to come. So stay tuned, everybody. And welcome back to It's All Right with Suzette, with our special guest, poet and author Carl Winderl, author of The Gospel According to Mary. Carl, you just read one of your fantastic poems, and I was really brought into the scene. I loved how it started off with the smells of pitch and linseed oil and things like that. It really kind of made the scene come alive. And there's so much of that within your poetry book. So I'm curious, what kind of literary influences are at play in your process and when you created the book?
I read quite widely. I'm sure you're not surprised to know that. I would tell my students that if you're an artist, you're a poet, you spend 50% of your time reading poetry, 50% of your time writing poetry. That's what all artists do. And so I'm infused by reading poets. I have my little, stable of poets that I like to read. But for me, I get up every morning, my first fruit of the hours are reading. I read books about Mary, I read books about theology, I read prose books, I study the scripture, I spend time doing my devotions. I feel blessed that I have my faith and art to integrate together, but I'm just a voracious reader. Everything that I read, in fact, I started a poem yesterday from reading a book by a Russian writer. I got the idea because during my morning's reading session, I came across an idea. I like to write what-if poems. The Kneeling at the Manger was, what if the shepherds were the ones who picked out the lambs for Passover and they came to the manger? The one I wrote yesterday, the new one, is what if Pontius Pilate and Jesus met at the pearly gates? What would that be like? What would Jesus say? What would Pilate say? So for me, I got that idea from reading this book by a Russian author. So it's hard to pin down any one book. I'm just reading lots of things that I think will give me ideas.
Yes. And, it occurred to me that if Pontius Pilate and Jesus met at the pearly gates, I'm sure the great hand washer of all times would probably say, really, it wasn't my fault.
Yes.
But, like we say, there are universal elements of maternal compassion, sacrifice, these beautiful, vivid images that come alive in your poetry. Now, I think that many might think, well, I don't know that Marian poetry is for me, but I think that you write to a much wider audience. Yes. So tell me, who is your audience?
Any mother who has had a son.
Oh, we're
I mean,
done.
seriously, really. I
Yes.
mean, the role of the matriarch is very complicated and complex. I think any tips that we can pass along the way. And this is the woman who had great sorrow and great joy. People were against her son. She had to deal with that. He had great success, but he also had some failures. He had betrayal. He had friends who turned against him. Um, the other thing about the Mary that is in these stories is that she's very contemporary. She's a cultural person who's very alive today. As you know from the text, she talks about painting. She talks about that some people, she muses about people thinking her as New Testament Barbie. Some of the painters, they dress her up like she's some kind of goddess. She discovers the tattoos on her son's body in the poem after his death. She even tells there's a poem about I too, where she talks about her tattoo. I think that this is a very contemporary woman. There's a book by Diane Chamberlain called Our Lady of the Lost and Found. It came out in 2002. It was recommended to me by one of my spiritual mentors at the Marian Research Center. And it's about a woman who appears in Canada, and she, spends the whole book, learning about Mary. It's a very contemporary thing. So the audience, I think, is wide ranging. You don't have to know a lot about Mary to read this book about Mary. You're going to learn. You're going to be educated, entertained. You'll be shocked. Things will be revealed and unveiled that maybe you hadn't thought of before.
I do love the idea that in your poetry, Mary is portrayed as a contemporary figure, someone that we can all relate to woman, because I think that the wrong assumption is that she's way up here, unattainable. We can never even hope to reach that level of sanctity and sacredness and perfection. And I really love how you have brought in some contemporary and very modern cultural ideas into her identity. Now, tell me, what are the literary influences in your own life? I know you spoke a lot about how you're a voracious reader, but are there particular poets or authors that you admire?
Well, like many English majors, we all were introduced to Emily Dickinson. E. Cummings was my favorite for a long time. In fact, a person who just did a review of the book said that when she read my poetry, she was put in the mind of E. Cummings. And that was like a pep rally. That made my heart happy again. I'm like, yes, he's one of my heroes. Obviously, Dante and the Divine Comedy, John Milton with Paradise Lost, Paradise. I mean, those are the old classics, but there's something going on between and beyond the lines. These are writers who dedicated their writing. Milton decided before he was much out of junior high that he wanted to write the greatest epic in the history of the English language. These are people who wanted to fuse their art and their faith, like Michelangelo, Botticelli. They were choosing to elevate their art and their faith at the same time. So I feel very blessed by that. James Dickey would be another one, Anne Sexton. The roll call can go on and on, but obviously, if you want to be a poet, you read poets.
Well, your book is absolutely rich with imagery. And I think that any reader, especially women, like when you say, well, who's my audience? Anybody who has a son, anybody who has children, because
Yes.
there is, great observation, deep sorrow, great joy. And your poetry makes it very, very vivid. Now, there are 62 poems in your book, and not all of them are set in biblical times. And as you say, they
Right.
can many contemporary references so that the reader can completely relate. If you'd like, I'd really like to make time to hear another selection right now.
I'm happy you asked. Okay. Because this is a good example of a poem that's very, very contemporary. It's the very first one. It's the one I wrote in 1974. It's the first poem in the book. It's called An Immaculate Conception. And it's like a preface. It's like where Mary introduces herself. And the title is An Immaculate Conception. In the basement of the Broadview, of all places, I go to sit and do my laundry and to commune with my soul. The washers swirl and swish the soiled clothes while I sit sensing, the cleansing. Rinsing to a frenetic spin stop, they tumble to an arid staleness. Silently, morosely, I await to wear the soilless linen in an unclean world. That's a poem I wrote in the laundry in graduate school, in the graduate dormitory. But you're right, it's one of those poems that if you didn't know something about the Immaculate Conception, you wonder, what is this very domestic imagery doing in a poem? But for me, the laundromat, the washer is like a womb image. It's dark, it's warm, things are clean, they're not dirty, you know, and this is her ahead of time. And in retrospect, if you go back to this poem, I think you understand that this is her before her son is born. This is before maybe she's even born, you know, contemplating what is my role in life. This poem, the very first place I sent it to in 1974 was the International Poetry Review, and they picked it. And I was like, this poetry thing's an easy game, you know. Well, I was wrong about that. But it was reprinted several times because of the domestic imagery. And I think this is an introduction to who Mary is, her persona, how she's going to focus on what it's like to be a woman. This is a very motherly-like thing here, is washing clothes.
I really love how you have created a Mary that is so relatable. And I think this is the beautiful thing about your poetry. The example you just gave is a very short one, but it's
Yes.
power-packed with feeling and imagery, just as a great poem would be. And what I think in these modern day times, when everybody has such a short attention spans, a book like yours, The Gospel According to Mary, would be such a wonderful, deep, meditative type of read, especially for those who don't feel they have the time, but they want to feel fed and
Right.
their spirits replenished. And so I have a question about spirituality. Obviously,
Sure.
your subject is very spiritual. The writing process is often very
Yes.
difficult, full of drudgery. How do you combine those elements of spirituality into your creative process? And what is your creative process?
I write from wake up time to lunchtime. In other words, when I wake up in the morning, 6 o'clock, 6:30, 7 o'clock. This morning I woke up about 6:15, had a light breakfast. For me, the first fruits of my day go to my writing. Primarily I work on poetry first, but as you mentioned, I also write, you know, creative nonfiction. That comes a little bit later in the morning or later in the day. But I feel absolutely blessed to be able to integrate my art and faith, as I said before. And it's an activity that gets me, you know, gets me out of bed in the morning. I would tell students, well, for me, if I can't write, I can't not write. I have to write. My day is not the same. And so this has given me a vision. It's given me a purpose. It's given me an opportunity to express myself. I've been doing this for a long time, as you can tell. I've been at this for a while. But the way that for me to write is I write a page a day. That's how I've gotten to the point. I don't finish a poem a day, but today I wrote this morning, I started a couple of new poems, and it's, you know, it's a way to energize me. And as you pointed out, almost all of the poems in the book are 1 page or less. This poem was only 14 lines, you know. So you're right, it gives someone else an opportunity to get engaged on a spiritual thought level too.
Well, I certainly appreciate you sharing your writing process because it's all so individual. I too do my best writing when I wake up, and by noon, I ain't no good for nothing after that. But it's
Yes, the day
amazing.
begins to.
Yes, it's amazing how, you know, you can wake up fresh, almost like, you know, your dreams have been rehearsed or
Yeah,
problems have been resolved closer to
yeah.
morning, and your creativity is strong. Now we have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like
Okay.
to ask you, first of all, tell us about when your book is going to be published, how we can buy it, and what
Okay.
is your, if you have a website.
Okay. We'll start with the easy one. No, I don't have a website. I've been recommended to have that, but I'd rather write poems than, you know, keep a website alive and whatever. My son keeps telling me I should do that, and he's a writer too, but he has one, but I don't. The book will come out in February. The pre-publication period is just around the corner. It'll be very easy to track down. Just Google Finishing Line Press, and when that website comes up, you'll see a little box that says search products. Just type the Gospel According to Mary. Click on that, and you will go directly to the page which will show the book. Eventually, it'll be on Amazon, Goodreads, and other fine ordering websites as well. But initially, it'll first be on finishinglinepress.com.
I see. I'm glad you mentioned that, because most people will go on to Amazon.
Right.
Yeah. So February is your publication date. And I understand, oh, Carl, you're old school, not a website, but that's all right. That's all right. As long as people know the name of it, The Gospel According to Mary, and they know to go to Amazon, I think they're going to be intrigued enough to buy your book. How can people get a hold of you if they choose to, if they'd like to do that?
If they want to track me down, my email is very simple. It's just my first initial, C. Winderl at pointloma.edu. pointloma.edu. C. Winderl at pointloma.edu. And
is there a period after C, or is it just C. Winderl?
Just straight C. Winderl.
Okay. Winderl. Well, that's great. And what else? You know, we have a few seconds left. I would love for you to tell us, you know, what this book means to you and what you hope it conveys to readers.
For me, it's an opportunity to share my faith and what I believe in. And I hope that it will inspire other people to search within themselves, whether it's Mary or Jesus or God, that they go on a spiritual journey. I think we're all in these days in need of refreshment. And there's so many things that are going to be counterproductive to our spirits. And so I think if this is a way to help, then fine.
Wonderful. That's great. And I know I'm a big fan of Mother Mary. And I know I had a very wonderful, profound experience at Ephesus.
Yes, I know.
So I want to thank you so much for being with us today. It was really a wonderful time, and we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, Carl Winderl, and hope to see you soon. Looking forward to your book. And we will see everybody the next time on It's All Right with Suzette. Thanks for joining us.